Dog Nation's postseason coverage, Go42n22, is made possible by our partners, including Kroger. Visit Kroger for all your holiday needs and to stock up for bowl season. R.S. Andrews, Dog Nation's choice for all your heating and air needs. Visit rsandrews.com to see how they can make you smile today. Marlowe's Tavern. Need a tasty gift this holiday season? Try a Marlowe's Tavern gift card. Visit marlowstavern.com. Georgia Farm Bureau. With local agents all across the state of Georgia, Georgia Farm Bureau is the home team. Find your agent today at gfbinsurance.com. Discover Dunwoody. Stay at one of our 9 hotels and enjoy easy access to 2 MARTA stations, which is just a short ride to downtown. Visit discoverdunwoody.com/dognation to book your stay today. Royal Caribbean. Reserve your cabin on the 2nd annual cruise with Dog Nation in April. Visit royaldogs.com to reserve your cabin today. The Wilson PC Personal Injury Attorneys. Because Atlanta happens from out of nowhere. When the unexpected happens to you, visit atlantahappens.com. The 7-6 Apparel Company. The perfect holiday gifts for the hard-to-find person in your family. Visit the76.com to start shopping today. And Berkshire Hathaway Home Services of Georgia. The best time for new beginnings is now. Forever moving you. Visit bhhsgeorgia.com to start your search today. And here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome into our Go for 2 and 22 special here, looking at the most recent which came out just a couple of moments ago. We're going to react to that here right now. Got Connor Riley as part of the conversation. Mike Griffith going to be on hand for this there as well. We just saw the top 25 a moment ago. No real change at the top with Georgia at #1, Ohio State at #2, Michigan at #3. Of course, those 2 teams playing on Saturday. Then you get to TCU at #4. And Connor, I guess I'll start with this. For me, there are only 2 really significant takeaways here from this ranking for me. The first is, while I don't believe they are eliminated from the college football playoff conversation right now, it is obvious this committee believes the ACC is the worst of the Power 5 conferences by a wide margin. Clemson's shown no respect whatsoever. I'm not sure they should be shown any respect. I just think it's fairly obvious to me that there is zero respect for Clemson, at least in terms of the national championship contenders, from this committee. The second thing is, if there was ever a week that you might consider moving TCU up because of the schedule they've been playing, I think that Baylor's a better team than either Maryland or, you might debate Baylor, Illinois, but certainly it's another quality opponent that TCU is playing. They're winning these games close, but they do continue to win. If there was ever a moment to think about playing around with the rankings and moving TCU up, especially as a middle finger to Fox, which has the Michigan-Ohio State game coming up on Saturday, this committee chose not to do that either. So for me, when I look at the top 25, those are the 2 things that I see. Clemson still kind of buried here a bit. TCU not really moving up in comparison to Michigan, Ohio State, or I guess even Georgia, if you want to say that. I don't make a huge deal right now about LSU being ranked ahead of USC because I don't think that stands if USC keeps winning. The issue for USC is whether or not they keep winning. So those are my takeaways. I'm curious to hear yours, what you thought of the night.
Yeah, I think the thing we both agree with here is on Clemson, and I think it's very clear right now. Clemson does not control their own playoff fate. I thought they'd maybe move them ahead of Alabama. Alabama's best win right now is over a 3-loss Ole Miss team. They've played in 5 one-score games this year, and I know this committee has very clearly shown us that they're just going to keep giving Alabama the benefit of the doubt. When I look at these rankings, and I think it's very realistic that USC drops one of its next 2 games. I think LSU is going to lose to Georgia. If TCU doesn't go unbeaten, is there maybe a path here for Alabama? I don't think there should be, quite frankly. I think Clemson is a better team than them. And ultimately, I do think Clemson is going to jump them in the rankings if they beat South Carolina this weekend, if they beat North Carolina next weekend, if they complete a sweep of the Carolinas and hold the Carolina State Championship belt for both the North and South states. I think eventually they're going to get there, but it's very clear that Clemson does not control its own playoff fate right here. I'm a little surprised that they kept USC below LSU. I guess they're giving LSU more credit there for the win over Alabama. And I do think eventually, similar to with Clemson, if USC beats Notre Dame this week, they're going to leapfrog LSU. And I do think USC still has its own clear path to the college football playoff. But really, I think the playoff committee, instead of making changes now, just said, we're just going to wait. We're going to let it play out. We know one of Michigan or Ohio State are going to lose this weekend. USC and Clemson both have opportunities this weekend against teams with marquee victories to move up, whereas Alabama is playing an Auburn team that is quite frankly not that impressive. LSU is playing a Texas A&M team that has been one of the, if not the biggest disappointments in college football this season. I think they're just content to say, hey, we're just going to wait until this results play each other out on the field.
I want to respond to something else you said a moment ago. Before that, though, is Mike Griffith with us? Is he a part of this broadcast right now?
At the moment, no. He might hop back on. I'm not sure.
Okay, he may be doing the there's a conference call with the CFP committee chairman, Boo Corrigan. He may be speaking to Mr. Corrigan here, and he'll join us a little bit after that. And you see the top 10, Tennessee dropping all the way down to 10 after getting embarrassed by South Carolina on Saturday. Oregon in at 9, Clemson in at 8. That's what we were just discussing a moment ago. Alabama does come in at 7 ahead of USC and LSU. And USC would appear to be, after beating UCLA on Saturday, one of the teams here more squarely in the mix. This, to me, is where some of the energy is for this week compared to a week ago, because USC has kind of gone out and gotten the kind of resume win they didn't really have prior to this. And, I think the last week you sort of saw this, belief that, hey, maybe USC is being propped up here a bit because they do have a Heisman candidate quarterback in Caleb Williams. They are USC out in Los Angeles, that there's some energy around USC, but really very little in the way of a resume to recommend them. When you go, air quotes, you're on the road and win at Pasadena last week, this is clearly the kind of signature type win that I don't believe that USC had before this. So I think there's some action and some energy around USC here. But Connor, I also want to respond to something you said a moment ago about Alabama. And I don't know if you were I know you're in Athens, so you may not have a chance to. I was watching the broadcast, and I heard the ESPN guys, Herb Street and Galloway and Greg McElroy and some of them, I heard them be more dismissive of Alabama's playoff chances than I've really heard them be about a team in most of these years. One of the things the committee almost never does is seemingly, and the ESPN broadcast reflecting the opinion of the committee, we almost never see anybody eliminated, right? Like, the fans want to eliminate so-and-so. They want to say, well, there's no way they can make the playoff. But the committee is usually pretty careful about leaving doors open. But if you really watch the ESPN broadcast tonight, maybe these are guys that are just shooting off the hip, and maybe this is not reflective of the actual state of affairs, but they were pretty dismissive of Alabama because the statement was, well, they're playing a 5-6 team on Saturday, and then after that, their season's done. This almost came across to me, and I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. I feel like sometimes I do this too much when we have our CFP conversation. But this almost felt like a little bit of a marked safe type situation for people who were worried Alabama be back in this thing. I think the ESPN broadcast took some pretty big steps tonight to say, for those of you who have Alabama fatigue, I don't think you have to worry about this here right now. Maybe they were kind of going into business for themselves by saying that, but I couldn't help but notice just how dismissive they were of Alabama's case, even though they're ranked 7th right now.
Yeah, Kirk and Reese, I think, both really hammered that point home there. And I think, again, right now looking at it, I think the most interesting thing is a week from now, I sort of touched on the scenarios earlier. I think there's one key piece here that potentially has to happen, and it's the result of that Ohio State-Michigan game. Because I think if Michigan wins that game, I feel pretty confident saying Ohio State is going to be ranked above Alabama, just because they do have that win over Notre Dame, and they have been, I think, the more consistently good team throughout the course of the season. If Michigan were to lose this weekend to Ohio State, and let's say it's not particularly close, which I think if we're ranking the possible results, big Ohio State win, close Michigan win, blowout Michigan win, I think Ohio State blowout win is one of the ones that is a real possibility there, given the way this offense can potentially play. Personally, right now, I'm not 100% certain this committee is going to rank a one-loss Michigan ahead of a two-loss Alabama. This is a Michigan team. What's their best win? Their non-conference resume was not very good. You have the win over Penn State, which admittedly was very impressive. But outside of that, is it Illinois? Is it Iowa? There's not a whole lot of meat on the bone, whereas at least with Alabama, they've got a ranked win over a Texas team. They've got a ranked win over an Ole Miss team, and both those two teams are currently ranked right now. And so, I hope the committee is right there, but look, I mean, USC has losable games this weekend and next weekend in the Pac-12 title game for that matter. LSU has a very losable game in the SEC championship game. TCU, whether they play, I think they're going to end up playing Kansas State. It was a game they were losing quite big at halftime before making a furious comeback there. And I could easily see them losing to Kansas State in the Big 12 championship game. I hope that ESPN is correct and maybe soothsaying us here that Alabama is not a threat to make the college football playoff. But so long as I see them ranked over a one-loss Clemson team and where they are at right now, I still think that Alabama has a potential to be in the playoff, especially because while, yes, they point out, they're playing a 5-6 team, they have a chance to get into the clubhouse and post that low number and say, hey, we're 10-2 right now. Our resume is what our resume is, but this is what we are. And while they can't necessarily help themselves, they're not going to be able to hurt themselves either, like I think a USC, a TCU, and LSU have the potential to do so.
So I want to run through a few things here. Some of this comment related, some of these are questions I want to ask you. Bo Brickle, I think, asked a really good question. If Ohio State runs the table, is there a chance the committee could then leapfrog them over Georgia, make them the number one overall seed? Atlanta is closer to Columbus than Arizona is, so that might have some relevance if you're an Ohio State fan. Do you think Ohio State has a path to be the number one overall seed?
No, I don't, because I think, and this is assuming that Georgia and Ohio State both win out, because if Georgia loses, I do think that obviously opens the door. If Georgia beats LSU, they're going to have another quality win in their cap. They're going to have a win over a very good Tennessee team that is still very likely to be ranked in the top 10 of the college football playoff rankings. They'll have the big win over Oregon, who could very well still win the Pac-12 there. The totality of Georgia's resume is going to end up being better than Ohio State's, I think, regardless of what happens in Columbus this weekend.
So Cassie Turner also asked the flip side of that question. Well, what happens if Ohio State loses? Which I do think is a really interesting question. So let's game this out here for a moment. Ohio State would have a non-conference win against a Notre Dame team that's 15th right now. I think they kind of, if you're making a football sort of based decision, eye test, sometimes you say, I think for most people, Ohio State passed the eye test. They haven't been maybe as good as casual observers think this year, but still, they got Marvin Harrison Jr. and C.J. Stroud. They're playing better defensively than they did a year ago. They'd kind of passed the eye test for most people. How do you think the committee would handle a non-Big Ten conference champion Ohio State in comparison to Clemson? They're certainly rated well ahead of them right now, or some of these other teams that would get in there. What do you think happens if Michigan wins against Ohio State and then goes on to win the Big Ten?
If it's a close Ohio State loss this week to Michigan, even if I think North Carolina wins out, I think they might take Ohio State. I think Ohio State has been the better team over the course of the season. They both would have one loss, albeit Clemson does have the conference championship in this theoretical scenario, winning the ACC. But we've seen before, even specifically with Ohio State, they will take a one-loss non-champion. Now, granted, not necessarily over a one-loss conference champion, but they will take a one-loss non-champion that they believe is more impressive than a conference champion. And there's also the bugaboo of the fact that this is a Ohio State team that beat Notre Dame, whereas Clemson got destroyed by Notre Dame. And I guess different points of the seasons there. Yeah. But, this is a Notre Dame team. Let's say they beat USC and game this out, because I do think that has to happen for Ohio State to get into the playoff and Clemson to factor into this. So let's say Notre Dame beats USC this weekend and knocks them out. I could very well see a scenario, because I do think Michigan is going to win this weekend, where you were debating Ohio State and Clemson. And I think given what we saw against Notre Dame, as unfair as that might be, given that Ohio State and Notre Dame played all the way back in week one, I do think that what we've seen from this committee and what they've said about Clemson in recent weeks, they would take an Ohio State team that lost one game to a fellow college football playoff team rather than a Clemson team that beat up on a pretty poor ACC schedule.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that head-to-head comparison with Notre Dame is probably the difference there. And then to reverse this around, I know you touched on this a moment ago, do we believe that the Michigan non-conference schedule is just too weak, even though I guess UConn's better now than they were? But is the Michigan non-conference schedule just too weak to make the field as an at-large team?
Yeah, I think the committee wants to encourage teams to keep playing marquee non-conference games. And I do think that if Michigan loses this weekend, they will not have a chance to make the college football playoff.
Could TCU lose and still make the playoff?
I think if they were going to lose, it would have to be this week. I think the conference championship feather would be one where if you win that Big 12, I think that is, and they're going to have a ranked win over either Kansas State or Texas. Kansas State is number 12. Texas, I believe, is number 22. I think they could, if they were going to lose, I think it would be this week. And I do think that they would take, based on the totality of TCU's resume, I would take a one-loss Big 12 champion TCU over a one-loss ACC champion Clemson. Now, again, TCU has to win the Big 12 title game. If they lose the Big 12 title game, I think it gets very, very interesting there. And so that's sort of the thing to watch. I do think that they could lose this week to Iowa State, which is, their record is 4-7. They have a very stout defense. That is absolutely going to be a game. And plus, that's just what we've seen from TCU week in, week out. They don't have the talent necessarily to blow teams out, but they found a way to consistently win close games. And I think that's what they're going to have to see them do again this weekend. So I think if TCU were to, I think there is a scenario where, let's say TCU loses this weekend, they bounce back, they beat Kansas State next weekend. I think they can still get in. I would still take a one-loss TCU Big 12 champion over a one-loss ACC champion in Clemson. Now, if Clemson wins the ACC and TCU does not win the Big 12, I think the committee is going to be forced to make a very tough decision and likely take Clemson in that scenario.
And by the way, you're watching our Go for 2 and 22 special here. Great collection of sponsors who make all of this possible. We're looking forward to a big week next week, live at the Marlowe's Tavern in Brookhaven on Wednesday. And, of course, our big kickoff tailgate. If you go to dognation.com, you can find out more about how you can be a part of that, including the first 200 people to secure their tickets. Also gets one of those second-generation Go for 2 and 22 T-shirts. So we have a huge week coming up next week, and obviously we're trying to set the stage for that right now with the latest college football playoff top 25 rankings that just came out a moment ago. LSU at 5 here is interesting. LSU is certainly playing a better brand of football than they were earlier this year. You got to give them credit for that. And while this is the kind of thing that caused me to say shudder the thought here, what happens if they do win the SEC championship game? What happens at that point in time, Connor? Because that's quite relevant for our audience, even if it's not the kind of thing that most of us want to consider, at least those of us who consider ourselves Georgia partisans. What happens if LSU wins the SEC championship?
I'm going to make a Heat reference here, so not everyone in this audience might get this, but I'll be in Phoenix. CV Rising. I do think Georgia, assuming they beat Georgia Tech this weekend, they're still going to get to go to the college football playoff. I think they'd be in regardless. But what's at stake when they play LSU in the SEC championship game? LSU very clearly is going to be playing for a spot in the college football playoff. And I think the winner of that game, Georgia LSU, the winner of that game is going to get to play in Atlanta. And so you would see LSU as the 4 seed. I think you'd have Georgia's 3 seed, but they would probably send Georgia out to Phoenix to play either TCU or USC in that scenario. Because I don't foresee a world where they have a 2-loss LSU, where their 2 losses, Tennessee, when they had Hendon Hooker at full strength, still a top 10 team in the country per the College Football Playoff Committee, and a Florida State team that is ranked 16th right now and has the potential to rise given some of the events that happen ahead of them. Kansas State has a losable game. Obviously, Notre Dame plays USC this weekend. They have a potential to move up in these rankings and possibly even get into a New Year's Six game if things break the right way for them there. So I think they're going to have a resume that will get them into the College Football Playoff. And if you lose that game, you're probably going out to Phoenix, something I don't think this team wants to do, given you could play 90 minutes away, or not 90, but 80, 70 minutes away down the road in Mercedes-Benz, a stadium you've already will have played in twice this season. So I definitely think that LSU can get themselves into the playoffs. But assuming Georgia wins this weekend, which I think we all do, they're a 35-point favorite, depending on what book you use. We use my bookie here at Dog Nation. I think you win this weekend, you get a spot in there. They've been an elite team over the course of the season. And compared to, I think, Ohio State and Michigan, they would have the superior non-conference win, along with a stronger conference schedule backing them as well.
Michael Porter is skeptical of this, the idea that Georgia would still make the playoff if it didn't win the SEC. So let's play this part of it out for a moment. I mean, from a strictly evaluative standpoint, obviously, Georgia would still be the power rated, the number 1 team in the country, but this committee kind of ignores those sort of power rating type metrics when they want to. So if it's an undefeated Ohio State, if it's an undefeated TCU, if it's a 1-loss USC, can you really take and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Can you really take a non-conference champion like Georgia over the kind of credentialed conference champions I just described? I mean, as a Georgia fan, that would give me a little bit of a pit in my stomach to think that you're having to make that argument for a second consecutive year to make the playoff without having won your conference.
Yeah, and I see that, and I would also point out that there were people last year on Sunday morning making the case for an 11-1 Notre Dame team to make the college football playoff and saying that it was going to happen at Georgia's expense. And obviously, an 11-1 Notre Dame is a very different scenario because you were describing USC winning out and TCU winning out. And the reality is, I don't think USC, TCU, all those teams are going to win out to put Georgia in that scenario. But I still think on the totality of their schedule where, by the way, look, USC, there's a good chance they play Oregon if they take care of Oregon State this weekend. you will have a head-to-head game potentially with USC playing Oregon and Georgia playing Oregon, both on neutral fields, might I add. Georgia beat Oregon by 46 points. And I know it was in week 1, but they beat them by 46. I don't see a world where USC beats them by 46. And if USC beats them by 46 or by 47 rather, then hey, go ahead, put USC in the playoff. I get it. That's sort of my argument there. But we saw what Georgia did to one of the very clearly best teams in the Pac-12, a league that USC in this scenario would have won. And Georgia just clearly proved they were a class above that. And this is a USC team. They beat UCLA by 3. They beat Oregon State by 3. They've played close games this season. I think they're going to play a close game against Notre Dame this weekend. I think they could possibly lose to Oregon, depending on Bo Nix's health in the Pac-12 title game. I understand the threat there that comes with USC winning out. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not certain TCU is going to win out either in that scenario.
Jeremy Smith mentions this Harold Perkins quote that's supposedly in the internet. Y'all, that quote ain't real. Y'all gotta keep your head on.
Plus, we don't even talk to the media. Like, this is, come on, guys.
Y'all gotta keep your head on the swivel about stuff like this. That Harold Perkins quote ain't real. I saw it. People shared it with me. That quote ain't real. Y'all gotta be better than that now. How about while we're doing devil's advocate stuff, let me do this thing on the other side here too. Are we sure that LSU makes the playoff if they win the SEC? Because there is precedent for this. Penn State was a 2-loss conference champion, beat Ohio State. The committee said, thanks for playing. We're taking Ohio State anyway. This happened in what, 2016?
Yep. Yeah, 2016. And I think that's a very fair scenario there as well. And again, yes, they lost to Florida State by a point, but they did not play well at all in that game. And I think they were lucky to even have it be as close as it was because Florida State, if I'm recalling correctly, and I am, they fumbled the ball on a goal line pitch and LSU drove the length of the field and scored a touchdown with 0 time left. So that game very easily could have been a double-digit Florida State win as opposed to a 1-point loss. And then again, look at what they lost to Tennessee 40-13, got blown off the field. And then 3 weeks later, Georgia played that same Tennessee team, albeit, Tennessee was on the road once again, as they were when they went into Baton Rouge. And that game was not a 27-13 final score. They dominated Tennessee there in that day. So I do think that there is the head-to-head, comparing resumes there of what each team has done. Georgia more thoroughly beat Mississippi State than LSU did there as well. And you can mention the Auburn game as well, where LSU had to come back from 17 down. LSU does control its destiny here, but I also wouldn't be shocked laying out the scenario you did where they might decide to take a USC and a Georgia instead of an LSU in that situation, obviously referencing the Penn State situation back in 2016.
I want to do 2 things with you here for a moment, and then we'll see if we can, if any commenters have anything they want to add to this. So here's what I'm a believer of. Is that the only team in the country that I believe is even a fair fight with Georgia is probably Ohio State. And yet, having said that, there's really only so much confidence I can have about Georgia winning the national championship. Now, my pick, I guess, is Georgia win the national championship. But I still think Georgia versus the field for the next 4 games is still one of those things. You got to play it out and you got to let it happen. We're talking about go for 2 and 22. But that's not like a prophecy. This is it's a mission. This is one of those things that Georgia's got to go out there and earn. I think Ohio State on a neutral field with Georgia is a fair fight. That'd be a tough game. Georgia would fight hard to win it. Ohio State would fight hard to try to win it. To me, that's a good game, fair fight type situation. Is there any other matchup for Georgia that you find intriguing in any way?
No. I mean, USC would be interesting on one side of the ball. Caleb Williams is obviously a dynamic player. Lincoln Riley, well, yes, they lost to Georgia in 2017 when he was the head coach at Oklahoma. They very easily could have won that game that day. That's an interesting game because I think Caleb Williams is singularly talented enough to be able to make that a game and consistently score. But that defense is atrocious, and I think they'd have their way with them, and that puts so much pressure on USC's offense that day. And I mean, look, I understand that being high in Ohio State, but looking a little bit at the weather this weekend in Columbus, I'm telling you right now, I think Michigan is winning this game on Saturday. This is an Ohio State team, and you see it with Georgia. You can't fake toughness. You can talk about being tough. You can't fake it, and you know it when you see it. And this Ohio State team has talked so much about being tough and being physical, and I'm sorry, I just haven't seen that in their play this season. This is a finesse team. They are like the Kings in NHL 93. This is not a team that is going to want to go toe-to-toe and punch you in the mouth for 4 quarters. And I think Michigan knows that. You're going to see it on Saturday, even with it being on the road. And C.J. Stroud, when you hit him, he has not played great this season or over the course of his career. When Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming are all singularly talented players, and JT Tuiamola is one of the best defensive players in college football as well. I just think there is still that toughness aspect that is missing from Ohio State. And I think it's going to show up against Michigan. And if Ohio State does find a way to win that game, I absolutely believe it's going to show up in the national championship game as well.
David Riddle on Facebook asked a good question. So Blake Corum is unhealthy, obviously, but is he planning on playing on Saturday for Michigan?
As of right now, I believe he told reporters that while he was giving out turkeys in Usplini, Michigan, that he is planning on playing. So we should expect to see him there. The other big name to know there, Donovan Edwards, a guy Georgia recruited very heavily out of Michigan. His status is up in the air, and he is another impact player for the Wolverines there as well.
And I think that your overall point is right here. We talk a lot about go for 2 and 22. I mean, it is setting up right now for Georgia to go straight forward and potentially go through whoever plays. It really is, that kind of situation here for UGA. Almost so much so that the entire conversation kind of is completely different. It used to be one of those things of, do you dare even speak this into existence that Georgia could actually win back-to-back national championships? Now it's one of those things of there's almost more pressure on Georgia right now than there was a year ago, because I think the field has been cleared for them right now in a way that it wasn't last year, I don't believe.
Not to get too math heavy on here, but 2-point conversions, the expected, conversion rate is 47%. Mm-hmm. Do you give Georgia better than a 47% chance of winning the national championship this year?
I do. I really do. I don't know what mathematically I would put it, but are the odds greater than half? I absolutely do. And I can tell you this, I was going to talk more about this in a moment. The best bet to making college football in terms of the most fun, it's not a futures bet because there's a pretty big hold on those in terms of the odds are pretty wretched. It's yes, no. Yes, no to make the playoff. Georgia's yes to make the playoff right now is minus 10,000. It means you basically have to bet $100 on a dollar, right? It's like, their odds of making the playoff are overwhelming here right now. This sets up for Georgia so well, so much that, as I said before, I think there's actually pressure on Georgia to win it because in life, the field is rarely as cleared for you as it is right now.
And that SEC championship game is going to be really interesting. We saw there was pressure on Georgia last year entering that game, and they frankly did not handle it well. And there's going to be a similar pressure on them this year. Now, I don't think this year's LSU team was as good as last year's Alabama team that they're going to see. But look, Harold Perkins, fake quotes or not, that guy is a game wrecker, and they've got some talented
real player.
Yeah, fake quote, real player.
Yeah.
They've got some guys that can make an impact. That defense, Ali Gay, BJ Ojolari, who a lot of Georgia fans wanted in the recruiting process. Keishon Butte has not had a great season. John Emery Jr. was a guy that Georgia recruited very heavily and ultimately had committed at one point. Jaden Daniels is the most athletic quarterback that Georgia is going to have seen this season, and I think a guy who uses his legs in a way that they can hurt this Georgia team, especially when no Nolan Smith, and I think personally speaking, not to get too X and O's heavy here, that outside linebacker position has left a little bit to be desired in Smith's absence. And that's a guy where I think, if they had Nolan there, you feel a lot more comfortable about containing Jaden Daniels. And so, there's going to be pressure on Georgia to win that game. But if they do, and I expect them to do so, to beat LSU on December 3rd in the SEC championship game, if they get that, they're obviously going to be the heavy favorite going into the college football playoff. But whether they're playing a TCU, Michigan, whoever they're playing in the semifinals, even I think Ohio State in the event that happens, Clemson even as well, we'll throw them in there. I think whoever they're playing, as long as it's not Alabama, which we don't believe is going to happen, I do think that they're going to cakewalk to whoever they have to ultimately play in the national championship game.
All right, we're about 2 minutes away from wrapping this up. So speaking of the yes-no bet, I just think it's the most fun thing in all of college football. Let's do some yes-nos. Your Georgia's obviously yes. Is your Ohio State a yes or a no?
My Ohio State is a no.
That's a strong opinion, Connor. It really is. Michigan is a yes.
My Michigan is a yes.
TCU is a yes to make the playoff, or a no?
TCU is yes. I'm going yes TCU.
LSU, I'm guessing, is a no.
LSU is a no.
USC is a yes or a no?
I'm going no with USC. I think they lose to Notre Dame this weekend.
So your fourth yes is Clemson, is that right?
My fourth yes is Clemson.
How about that? That's really interesting. Do you think that LSU is the best team remaining that Georgia will play this year?
Based on the scenario I just laid out there, yes, I do. Now, if Michigan and LSU play on a neutral field, I think Michigan would win. But I think with the way Michigan is built, and I think this Michigan team is worse than the team they saw last year, at least from an athleticism standpoint. I think of the scenario that I just laid out there, if it is Georgia, Michigan, TCU, Clemson, I think Georgia should feel very, very comfortable about where they sit in the college football playoff.
Yeah, I was doing devil's advocate before, and now I want you to do devil's advocate. If Georgia were to face Michigan in the playoff, give me the most like sort of pro Michigander argument of all for why this year's game would be different than last year's game.
The Michigan offensive line, I believe, is better this year than it was last year. And I think the Georgia defensive line as a whole is a step back. And so you might be able to make that a closer game, given that matchup is not going to be quite as lopsided there. Defensively, again, I just think they're not as athletic as they were on that side of the ball a year ago. And I think this Georgia offense pretty clearly is better than it was a season ago. But, the reason Michigan was so overwhelmed in that game is just because they could not handle the defensive front. They would be better equipped, in my opinion, this year to handle this Georgia defensive front, but I'm still not 100% certain that they would win more often than they don't.
My playoff right now is Georgia, Ohio State, USC, Clemson. I believe that TCU loses. And somehow, some way, I feel like them losing is going to open the door for Clemson, even though the rankings don't necessarily suggest that right now. That's my take. And I just think Georgia wins the national championship. I just think they do. I think it seems like I think Ohio State's better than you do. I agree. They're a soft football team. And yet I still feel like they're better defensively than they were a year ago. And they're at least good enough offensively, even though on a week-to-week basis, I swear to you, they haven't been as good as some people think they have been. But I still feel like they're a pretty formidable challenger. I think Georgia-Ohio State's probably a better game than it sounds like you think it would be. But I do believe that's a game that Georgia would win. I just don't see right now a team in the country who's capable of beating Georgia. I believe Ohio State would give them the best game. And to be frank, I think Alabama would give them the second best game right now.
I actually might think that Alabama might give them the best game in the country. And I've said, this is not a vintage Alabama team, but I still think, I saw somebody ask if you give, Caleb Williams, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, and whoever the fourth best quarterback in the country is, Max Duggan, whoever you want to go with there, you're building a team and who you're starting a quarterback. I'm still picking Bryce Young. That guy is nails. We've seen what he can do against Georgia. And similarly to, I think, Ohio State being a soft football team, I think CJ Stroud folds under pressure too easily. And Jalen Carter, look, we saw it with Hendon Hooker, and I give Hendon Hooker a lot of credit for the way he played and stood in there in that game. He kept getting up after getting obliterated game after game, and I don't know that I believe CJ Stroud has that same trait.
Final thought, what was your favorite part of watching Tennessee tumble all the way down to 10 tonight?
I mean, on the one hand, I do hate, I hate for Tennessee, and Hendon Hooker, we can keep it player specific here, that his career is going to end on the note in which it did, tearing his ACL. Yeah. But for the Tennessee fans, I mean, maybe you do beat South Carolina on a neutral field where there's no rain and you can figure out how to stop Spencer Rattler, which seemingly every other program in the country has proven capable of doing so, except for that vaunted Tennessee defense. And Tennessee, look, they're going to be big favorites over Vanderbilt this weekend. Don't sleep on those Commodores. That team is playing for a bowl game. They are at home. They just beat Florida a week ago. They beat Kentucky the week before that. They're playing for a bowl game. Tennessee, if you think you can sleepwalk through that game, I'm sorry, but that's not what I have seen from your team as of late. Just getting absolutely obliterated this past weekend. And if Tennessee wants to make a big New Year's Six bowl game that is still in front of them, that is still something absolutely worth playing for. We saw this in 2016, a year that we keep bringing up here, where all they had to do was beat Vanderbilt last game of the season. They're playing probably in the Orange Bowl or in the Sugar Bowl, actually. I know for a fact they would have played in the Sugar Bowl that year. Mm-hmm. And they lose to Vanderbilt, and things sort of unravel for Butch Jones really quickly after that. You wonder if maybe something similar like that happens this time around.
We're kind of losing the plot here, but I have to point this out. Tennessee's only around a 2-touchdown favorite against Vanderbilt on Saturday. Like, that's an alarming point spread. And I realize quarterback, I get all that, and I guess Vanderbilt's won 2 in a row. But that's still, an alarming point spread here for a Tennessee team that's trying to keep this from going completely off the rails here. The number may be 15, but it's like 14 or 15. Like, it's like right there around or just above 2 touchdowns right now. That is pretty interesting stuff. Anything else, Connor, from like down the list here? Looks like, you got Tulane, Cincinnati battling each other. That's going to determine who ends up being the highest ranked Group of 5 team after UCF couldn't handle its success. I tell you, quietly's playing pretty good football right now is Penn State. Like, they're just kind of sailing right along. They're not anybody's, obviously playoff list for good reason, but they're quietly playing pretty good football right now. Anything else of note to you? I think Florida State probably has some woulda, coulda, shouldas they'd like to be kicking around here because their season could have been quite different. Anything else?
Yeah, Florida State a one-score loss to NC State. Where you look at that, they're feeling very different about their season right now. Don't sleep on Oregon State here. This is a team flown a little bit under the radar. They gave USC a really tough game earlier this season. Oregon coming off an emotional win this past week over Utah. They've got a lot to play for, but that game is not going to be a gimme for Dan Lanning and his crew. And Bo Nix sounds like he's healthier this week than he was a week ago. This is not the team you want to play coming off a physical Utah team. Oregon, handle your business this week, because if you're sloppy for a second, I think Oregon State is going to be in a position to make you pay for it, and that would really derail what has been a very strong debut season for Dan Lanning. And one last thing, I can't take credit for this because Steve Spurrier was out there saying this. If Tennessee's not careful this week, they might be playing on a bowl game that begins with a U and a T, and that'd be the old Citrus Bowl.
That is great to think about. Hey, it's Go for 2 and 22. We mean it. It's all laid out here in front of Georgia. If you go to dognation.com, you can read more about the college football playoff rankings that come out, how it impacts UGA. Dogs at number 1, no doubting about that. But everything else below them, pretty interesting right now. Connor, you did a great job of breaking all this down. I look forward to hearing more of your official picks for some of these games of the weekend as we get ready to do Go with Flow. And obviously, we'll have your picks as a part of that show coming up this week here, too. Also, hope you have a very happy Thanksgiving, Connor. I'm thankful for your contribution to my work throughout the week, and looking forward to sharing this college football playoff experience with you as we roll into the month of January. So enjoy your time. Thanks for being here tonight. We'll look forward to talking to you soon.
BA would not be – oh, well.
I think you're still there, Connor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
this is like when the rock concert has the encore. Like the curtain came down. Now it's back up. Hey, we're going to play 3 more songs. Go ahead.
BA, we've talked about this before. It would not be where I am without you. Thank you so much for all that you have done for me. Thank you guys, Dog Nation, for tuning in. We'll be probably back here next Tuesday previewing LSU, Georgia going for 2 in 2022, and hopefully looking forward to more college football playoff talk as Georgia's poised to be back in it this year.
And while we're all giving out thank yous here to the entire audience who joins us here tonight, appreciate you doing that on Tuesday night. Y'all enjoy these rankings. Enjoy where Georgia is right now. Keep a good thought about Go for 2 in 22. There you go. Let me see if I can get it in the screen. There you go. Go for 2 in 22.